Um, First of all, thank you all for coming. It's very nice to be here. I'd like to start by thanking Mr. Thomas Tam for inviting me to give a lecture on simultaneous interpretation. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this lecture series at RE, and I've noticed the tremendous scope of the lecture topics, this rich array of subjects that we have every week, anything from responses to the tsunami disaster in Asia, to interesting cultural trips to Tibet or Mongolia, or a topic like costume TV dramas in China. My thanks also go to Mr. H.J. Lee Hongzhen, who is not only a colleague at the UN, but also a high school classmate from St. Paul's Coeducational College in Hong Kong. He spoke on the topic Lost in Translation earlier in the year. It was he that suggested that I give a companion talk, or companion lecture on a related but somewhat different field of simultaneous interpretation. I think it's a felicitous coincidence that this lecture is taking place on the same day of the opening of the film The Interpreter, a political thriller that stars the beautiful Nicole Kidman and Sean Penn. My colleagues and I are certainly very appreciative of the interest and glamour that movies like that lend our profession, and we all look forward to seeing it. The topic of my talk is simultaneous interpretation, past and present, and I'll be going backwards and forwards between past and present. Before I give an overview of the origins of this field and how it all came about, I'd just like to explain a little bit about what simultaneous interpretation is. It's not translation. Translation involves the translation, as it were, from one language to another of written documents, and the product is something written. Interpretation is completely verbal, although in the process you may need or try to use written documents. It's also not to be confused with consecutive interpretation, which involves interpreting after the speaker has spoken a few sentences, a paragraph, sometimes a whole speech. Simultaneous interpretation requires speaking at the same time as the interpreter, or roughly at the same time, and mastering the technique of listening, thinking, and speaking at the same time. It can be described as driving a car, but a car that has no steering wheel and no brakes. You don't know which way the speaker is going. You don't know what he's going to say. The shape of the sentence is indeterminate, at least for a while. And also, you have to keep talking. You can't stop until he stopped talking. Somebody also thinks that it's like a game of tennis, where as soon as you sent the ball across to the other side, across the net, your opponent sends it back. You're on your toes all the time. It's a lot of pressure. It's sort of a high-pressure balancing act. To be accurate and convincing, the interpreter must be able to grasp the meaning of the original, to process it mentally, and then deliver it effectively in the output language. It's a profession for people with quick reflexes, strong nerves, and who enjoy the power of persuasive speech. Now I'm going to talk about how the profession came into being. The birth of simultaneous interpretation had everything to do with the Second World War. After World War II, at the Nuremberg war trials in 1945, major Nazi war criminals were put on trial, and for the first time simultaneous interpretation was provided in 4 languages: English, French, Russian, and German. It had been used on a trial basis before, but Nuremberg was the first time it was used on a large scale. At that time, Eisenhower's personal interpreter, Colonel Doster, organized a team of simultaneous interpreters, put in the system, and those leading interpreters at the time later became interpreters at the United Nations. The interpreters had to see the speakers at the Nuremberg trials, so they were placed very close to the defendants in glass boxes, and we call them booths till this day. The facilities were very primitive. 3 persons had to share one microphone, and the earphones were very, very heavy. They were the size, the microphones were the size of a grenade. So the use of simultaneous interpretation proved successful and facilitated the proceedings, which were long and involved a lot of enormous amount of material. Consecutive interpretation was used by the League of Nations during the early days of the UN. Consecutive meant that the speaker would speak first, then the interpreter would interpret, and so on and so forth. At the League, there were the famous Kamenkera brothers, Jean and André. They were French, and it was said that one of them could listen to a whole hour-long speech without taking notes and then deliver the whole thing accurately without omissions. That's something that someone like me can't imagine. My attention span is much, much shorter than that. Anyway, after the war, at the first session of the General Assembly in London, that was in January 1946, the delegate of Ukraine referred to the Nuremberg trials and the success of the simultaneous interpretation there, and put forward the proposal that UN delegates should be superior diplomats, not necessarily people with superior language skills. The proposal was adopted, and the search was on for good interpreters. So at the fall session of the GA, that was scheduled to be held in New York, the Nuremberg interpreters were to be part of a team who would demonstrate the effectiveness of simultaneous interpretation to UN delegates and officials at the beginning of the GA session. So prior to this, some consecutive interpreters welcomed the new system and trained themselves with written documents and tapes, but others resisted. They were the consecutive interpreters who viewed the simultaneous interpreters with some degree of contempt and called them téléphonistes, telephone operators, because they wore earphones. Anyway, eventually, in spite of some technical glitches with the equipment, the demonstration was successful, and the delegates were satisfied with the interpretation. So at that time, as early as in 1946, the Budget Committee, the 5th Committee, was already the busiest committee at the United Nations, and that was a committee that asked for a team to be pressed into service immediately. Very soon, all the committees of the GA could see how practical simultaneous interpretation was, because it saved a lot of time. You were speaking simultaneously, so you didn't have to wait till several languages had to be interpreted, possibly doubling or tripling the amount of time that a meeting took. So that was a saving in time, and also, of course, in money. And before long, all the committees started clamoring for simultaneous interpretation. Eventually, the simultaneous interpreters won out in the power struggle, and this became the dominant form of interpretation at the United Nations. By the early 70s, when I joined the UN, consecutive was used only occasionally, or even very rarely, in the Security Council, in addition to simultaneous, and the Military Staff Committee was the only organ that used it until very recently, when it was phased out also. I'd like to talk a little bit about how the different booths, the different language groups work together at the United Nations. There are 6 official languages at the UN: Arabic, English, French, Spanish, Chinese, and Russian. So the Secretariat itself uses 2 working languages, English and French, with English being the leading language. For reasons of linguistic and cultural diversity, all 6 languages are considered equal, and there can be no discrimination against any of them. In the mid-90s, there was a General Assembly resolution on multilingualism, where the Foreign Minister of France affirmed its importance. For Chinese, China is the main user, but Singapore has stated at a GA meeting that she uses 2 UN official languages, English and Chinese, though they've never been known to speak Chinese. A number of Asian countries have shown an interest in Chinese. Prior to the completion of the text of the Law of the Sea Treaty in 1982, the chief delegate of China headed up a working group to verify the accuracy of the Chinese version, and there were participants from Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. The majority of member states speak English, with countries that are former colonies of France and Belgium speaking French: Gabon, Senegal, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Those of Spain and South America speak Spanish. Russian has lost ground with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The countries of the Commonwealth of Independent States are increasingly using English rather than Russian. Say, for instance, the Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Armenia. English has also tended to gain ground over French in countries of the former French Indochina, such as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Arabic is spoken mainly by over 20 countries of the Middle East, and also by African countries like Somalia. In general, English dominates multilateral diplomacy, especially in meetings where documents are negotiated and drafted. So how do the interpreters work together? The English, French, Russian, and Spanish booths work in one direction, usually into their native languages. For instance, from French and Russian into English, or French and Spanish into English, or English and Russian into French. And usually two interpreters are working at any one meeting. The Arabic and Chinese booth work in both directions, into their native languages and the other way around into English or sometimes French. This means that they're working into their own languages most of the time from their native languages when delegates using Chinese or Arabic are speaking. So they work therefore in teams of 3 because of the high workload. So most of the Chinese interpreters in headquarters work in English and Chinese only, some in French and Chinese, and more of them work from French in Geneva. Since many of the Arabic interpreters were educated in French and English, about 1/3 of the Arabic colleagues work from or into French. So the 6 booths work in concert. They are interrelated and interdependent. Unless an interpreter is proficient in all the 6 languages, sometimes the floor language is the one that he doesn't know. So he has to depend on a colleague in another booth to interpret first into a language that he knows, and then do his interpretation based on the other colleague's interpretation. This is a process we call relaying. So if the delegate of Egypt is speaking Arabic, a colleague from the Arabic booth interprets into English, and then all the other booths would have to relay from his English interpretation going into their own languages. So that gets quite tricky sometimes, but that's how it works. And the whole system would break down. We couldn't do that. The relaying could also be into French. Last year we have a new colleague who originally worked for China's foreign ministry, and her specialization is French. So now we have somebody who works from Chinese into French, say in the Security Council, and then the English booth would have to listen to her French interpretation, go into English, and then other booths would just do whatever they can, relaying either from French or English. So in a sense, the way we work together, it's a little bit like the different sections of an orchestra, where the woodwinds or the brass or the percussion instruments, all the different musicians have to work together to produce a concert, which is a UN meeting. I'd like to talk a little bit about the background of the interpreters and what kinds of people the profession has attracted. When I first came to the UN in the early 70s, some of the colleagues who were my mentors had very interesting backgrounds. They were mostly from China, some from Taiwan. Mr. Zhu, somebody already in his mid-50s, who had a near-native command of Russian. He knew English as well, but he grew up in Harbin and he could interpret directly from Russian into English. Mr. Paul Yu was a good friend of mine at that time. He studied in France and England and had a specialization, France and Switzerland, and had a specialization in international law to a high level. So he interpreted from French and gave me a lot of encouragement and inspiration for learning additional foreign languages. When China first started participating in the work of the UN in the early 70s, the profession attracted a lot of students from Hong Kong and Taiwan who were studying or living abroad at the time. So in the 80s, an interpreters and translators training program was established in Beijing, and qualified candidates became available. And today, the vast majority are graduates from that school. A lot of our colleagues who joined the UN in the 70s haven't always majored in languages in college. Some studied maths and science instead of languages. And at the same time, they had the linguistic ability and proficiency to become interpreters. The fact that they had varied academic backgrounds and interests were a great help in tackling the wide range of subject matter at the UN, which is often quite technical. Now, there are some who have joined us from the Foreign Ministry, and they've had past experience working for state leaders or ministers, bringing their experience to the UN. Others have worked for they've somehow come back to this profession after many years. There's been movement in the other direction also. Some of my colleagues had gone on to brilliant diplomatic careers, one of whom is Zhang Qiyue, whom you probably know as one of the spokespersons until recently of China's foreign ministry. And now she's been appointed ambassador to Belgium. And there are others. China's, the PRC's first UN ambassador, Huang Hua, had been an interpreter in his youth. Mr. Ji Chaozhu had also come from a long and distinguished career in interpretation, and eventually he became a diplomat and ambassador to the UK and a high UN official. In the other booths too, there are people who are very talented and who are very well-rounded in all kinds of ways. I have a Uruguayan colleague in the Spanish booth who's also a concert pianist and has performed in many countries, including the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, how's the timing? I just want to talk a little bit about the General Assembly and the Security Council and what's involved in servicing those meetings. Every year, there's a general debate between mid-September and mid-December when prime ministers and foreign ministers come to deliver their policy statements. That's still different from the special meetings at the level of heads of state and government, like during the 50th anniversary of the UN in 1995 and the Millennium Summit in 2000. We're coming up to the 60th anniversary, so the same high-level meeting will be held later this September. For the general debate, in addition to the 6 official languages, higher-ranking speakers are allowed to bring their own interpreters to interpret their speeches from their own languages, which could be Hindi, it could be Japanese, Portuguese, Latvian. In these cases, government interpreters would deliver their speeches from the English booth. And occasionally, English interpreters, say, who have a good command of Portuguese as well as Spanish, may be assigned to work from that language, interpreting, say, the foreign minister of Mozambique. So we can expect interpretations to be regularly broadcast on TV and radio or webcast through the UN's website. For the Chinese booth, the foreign minister's annual statement is a centerpiece, and usually translations in English and French are provided. It's been my experience that even if translations are provided, you have to be careful because last-minute changes can be made, or sometimes the speeches are read at great speed, which means you have to be on your toes and speed up yourself. For working into Chinese, each interpreter prepares a complete statement usually of 15 minutes, and they can be 20 or 20 minutes in some cases. Chinese interpretation is recorded and used directly for conversion into records. Let me talk a little bit about the Security Council. This is the highest political organ of the UN, and it meets throughout the year. Binding decisions are made only in formal meetings where resolutions are adopted, say to address or prevent threats to international peace and security, to send a peacekeeping operation, or to renew the mandate of an operation, to change its mandate, or to carry out sanctions against a country because of a violation of a council resolution. A formal meeting is also able to adopt a presidential statement, which has no legal force but has some political force. It can appeal for military restraint or ceasefire between warring parties or return to negotiations for peace. So important political topics are discussed in debates in formal session and may be limited to council members or open to the general membership. When it comes around to China's turn to preside in the council, it's a matter of additional importance to the Chinese booth. Rotation is based on an alphabetical order of the names of the members, and the success of the presidency and the effectiveness of the council for the month would depend in part, of course, on the accuracy and quality of our interpretation. A lot of work is actually done behind the scenes in informal consultations. Senior members of the Secretariat are invited to brief the Council on the prevailing situation in different hotspots in the world. In recent years, 60% of the work of the Council has been about Africa, where conflict and strife abound. Now, informal consultations are more designed for dealing with crises and problem solving and are more like a dialogue, something interactive. Occasionally, consultations also fall into a pattern of prepared statements, but that's hard to avoid. Texts of draft resolutions and presidential statements are initiated and submitted at the ambassadorial level in the consultations, but negotiated and drafted in detail at the level of councillors. In those meetings we also service. When the Council is discussing any matter of widespread political interest or matters of some sensitivity, the press is waiting at the door for news of the discussions. So what the President says to the press is a matter of intense interest among the Council members and often the object of very painstaking discussions and negotiations. Okay. I'd like to go on to talking a little bit about some memorable occasions in my own career going back to the 1970s. Thank you very much. In 1979, just after the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, Prince Sihanouk gave a moving speech at the beginning of a debate in the Security Council, which was then requested by China. He spoke in French about the lightning speed of the massive invasion, the swiftness of the loss of his country to foreign occupiers, and the deep sadness which he felt. So Singapore, a country from the region, spoke strongly against the invasion and emphasized the charter principles of the non-use of force in international relations, the non-viability of international borders, and the cardinal principle of national sovereignty. He felt that small countries needed to be protected from the incursions of the large and the powerful. The speaker was Ambassador Tommy Koh of Singapore, who spoke in English and whose lucid and terse speaking style was a delight to many of us. In April 1982, Argentina was under the military government of General Galtieri, and he launched an attack against the Malvinas Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina. Eventually, Margaret Thatcher's government sent a whole armada of warships across the Atlantic, defeated the Argentines, and retook the islands. For some days, there were troop movements building in Argentina in a way that suggested a possible invasion. and tensions in the region were beginning to rise. Informal consultations of the Council were convened by Ambassador Ling Qing of China, and as members discussed the gravity of the situation, a UN official handed him a note. He opened it, looked at it, and then said to the Council, "I've just received an urgent message indicating that Argentina has launched an all-out attack on the Malvinas Falkland Islands. The situation is serious." So to me, even though this was happening basically in the southern tip of South America, it was a very dramatic moment, and I appreciated being there. The Council adopted Resolution 502, calling for the withdrawal of Argentine troops from the islands and the immediate cessation of hostilities. In the summer of 1988, I was working at a formal meeting of the Council, presided over by Ambassador Lu Ye of China. At the meeting, the President read out a presidential statement announcing the signing of a ceasefire between Iraq and Iran, including the exact details of the time and place of the signing. This ended a long, fratricidal war between the two neighbors lasting 8 years, which took a great toll on both Iraq and Iran. I believe the then UN Secretary General, Perez de Cuellar, had been personally involved in orchestrating the peace negotiations together with other interested countries. At that moment, as I was reading it, I really felt I was observing an important moment in history. On the 1st of July 1997, I interpreted for ABC News a live broadcast of the handover ceremony for Hong Kong's return to China. This was an emotional assignment for me. The ceremony was scheduled to take place at midnight in Hong Kong, and the broadcast was part of Peter Jennings' daily program, Good Morning America. And the work was to be done, my interpretation was to be done here at ABC Studios. The event was taking place in Hong Kong. Anyway, before the event, I asked ABC why they couldn't broadcast directly the English interpretation that would surely be provided from Hong Kong by Jiang Zemin's own interpreter. But apparently that couldn't be done. They couldn't get permission from China Central TV, who apparently controlled the broadcasting rights, and no, at least as far as I know, no US network got hold of that permission. Anyway, on the day of the broadcast, I asked if I could get something, something in Chinese faxed over, but there was nothing. So I knew that this was going to be a kind of a rigorous requirement, winging it, just listening to the speech and doing it sort of off the cuff and basically on the air. But I thought I would still do it, because it's an opportunity that comes around, shall we say, once every 150 years. So it was really a very interesting experience. It was like being suspended in time and space, straddling two continents, being a conduit at the time of a major historical event, and one that's pregnant with meaning for Chinese people, and especially the people of Hong Kong. So what I'd like to do now is play the video of the